Welcome to our LinkedIn. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. My name is Jacki Zehner. Welcome to our LinkedIn Live today. Just want to give folks a second or two to join our call. So if you want to say hello in the chat, tell us where you are joining from, please feel free. We are in Park City, Utah on this beautiful day, this beautiful morning in Park City. So excited for this conversation. It's been a minute since we've had a LinkedIn Live, so I'm super happy to be here today with a couple of amazing guests. So again, we'll just give folks a second or two to join us before we get started and welcome our guests to the stage. You might be noticing my Wonder Woman collection in the background. No surprise if you have joined us for a call before. I love the character of Wonder Woman. Have a lot of the pieces here at the office. We're based in Kiln in Park City, Utah. And I'm joined in the room with all our wonderful team members who will be supporting the event today. So great. I think we'll get started. So thank you so much for joining for this post-election conversation about the U.S. economy and economic policies. And because we are SheMoney, we will be approaching this conversation with a gender lens. We will be discussing forces shaping women's financial access and well-being with the hope of really illuminating some of the structural changes that are still needed. We will not cover everything today. We simply can't in 1 hour. And my hope in this conversation is to increase awareness that so many things that we label as women's issues are really people and family issues and economic issues. And that really is what SheMoney is all about. On Tuesday, just 2 days ago, I published our November SheMoney newsletter on these topics, featuring one of the guests that will be joining us today. So if you have not subscribed to the newsletter, we will pop it in the chat and invite you to do so. We have over 160,000 direct subscribers already. I've been writing this newsletter for many years and always appreciate your support, signing up, and please send it to friends. And in addition, we're deep in planning mode for our 2025 offerings with SheMoney. So there's becoming ever more ways to engage with us. So please follow SheMoney as our business here on LinkedIn, me personally. And we have also the ShePlace SheMoney, a second newsletter. So we invite you to subscribe to that as well. So I am so excited to introduce and welcome to this conversation two extraordinary humans and women. They have become absolute dear friends of mine and share my passion to create greater levels of economic access and equity. And we will pop into the chat all the ways to support them. So I'm going to introduce you first, before she joins us, to Josie Cox, who was the subject of the latest SheMoney newsletter. Josie is the author, hello Josie, of Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality. This absolutely compelling book, I'm going to hold it up right now. It's got a beautiful cover, kind of matches our outfits today. Was published in March of this year, and it tracks the history of women's economic advancement in the United States. Josie is a journalist, author, broadcaster, and public speaker who has worked on staff for Reuters, The Independent, The Wall Street Journal. As a freelancer, she has written for The Washington Post, The Spectator, Guardian, Business Insider, MSNBC, Fortune, Forbes, and other publications. She is also a regular contributor to the BBC as a writer and broadcaster and a founding editor at The Persistent. She has a BA from the University of Bath, where I just came from London last week. We have that where my daughter lives right now. I'm so excited. MBA from the Columbia Business School and has been a fellow at the Columbia School of Journalism as well. I mean, those are some incredible credentials, Josie, and she's an amazing person, I'll just say. Welcome to the conversation, Josie Cox.
Thank you so much, Jacki.
Our second guest today also has become a dear friend. Heather McCulloch is a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute of Financial Security Program and a national thought leader on gender economic equity. She founded and leads the Women in the Economy Project and manages a cohort of leaders focusing on inclusively owned commercial real estate in underinvested communities. Prior to joining the Aspen Institute, Heather was the founder and executive director of Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, a national network of leaders from across sectors dedicated to building a gender equitable economy. Her insights have appeared in major publications such as CNN Business and the New York Times. Heather holds a Master's of Science in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics, have that in common as well, and a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. She has taught at UC Berkeley and recently joined the Gender Equity Advisory Council of the California Partners Project. Welcome to both of you, you two beautiful humans. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, obviously, the frame of the conversation that we're going to have today is about women, money, and policy. And this conversation, of course, is happening post-election, where Donald Trump will be the incoming president, and we will have a Republican-controlled Senate and likely House. So clearly, we will talk about what is likely to change as a function of the current political climate. And we also know that the road to greater levels of financial inclusion and equity is a very long one indeed, and still very much under construction. So before we talk and jump into the present, I want to talk a little bit about the past. Let's take a little time up front of this conversation, talking about some historical achievements, pieces of legislations, and other events that have propelled us forward to where we are today, as well as bring in some research and data that we already know about that will make a difference in terms of the economic well-being of women and families. So let's start there. So Josie, I'm going to kick off this conversation with you and this amazing book, which I was so excited to read, that you just published back in March. Again, to mention the title again, Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality. And for those that may not have read the book just yet, or even our SheMoney newsletter, which goes into a lot more detail about the book, can you please share why you chose to write this book and just give us a brief description of the book as we get started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jackie. It's just such a joy to be here with two of my favorite people in the world right now. So thank you. As you said, Women, Money, Power came out in March. It was really something that I feel like I've been working on for the last 15 years, even though I only really put pen to paper about 3-4 years ago. As you mentioned in your intro, I've been a journalist for about 15 years. Started my career writing about financial markets, so a very different world in some ways to the world in which I find myself today professionally. I was a stock markets reporter. I was a bond correspondent. I wrote about FX and commodities and basis points and all that sort of those dry nuts and bolts. But ultimately, beneath the surface, I always had this sort of bubbling desire to really address something that troubled me right from the very get-go, which was that the world of big money, the investors, the traders, the bankers who kind of run this universe that I was reporting on, are predominantly male. And they were at the time, and they are today still, and predominantly white men at that. And it troubled me. And so I feel like that was sort of the genesis of my desire to explore this gender gap in the world of money and in the world of power by extension in greater detail. I spent most of my career working in the UK. I moved to the US in March 2020 to New York on the 13th of March, right on the cusp of the global pandemic. And one of the things that struck me most about my move to the US was that inequality, economic inequality, along gender lines, along racial lines, along other lines, is so sort of sewn into the fabric of society. And I knew that as somebody who cares deeply about inequality and wants to use my platform to address that and to try and rectify inequality, I knew that this was the time to write a book like this. But I was also, profoundly aware of my limitations. I'm not an economist. I'm not a historian. I'm a storyteller. I'm a journalist. And so I knew that I wanted to tell stories, tell human stories. And essentially what I decided to do was to go back in history and profile the women through history who fought for economic equality in order to be able to answer this overarching question, which I think many of us are asking ourselves today, which is, why are we where we are today? Why is inequality still so rampant between genders, between races, whatever metric you choose? Where have we gone wrong, and what can we do, and what can we learn from history in order to do that?
Thank you, Josie. And obviously I share your passion as a former trader at Goldman Sachs in the 80s and 90s. And in fact, that's what motivates me to this day, is seeing women largely absent from those places and spaces. And I actually, in reading your book, I thought I knew a lot, frankly. I pay attention to different pieces of legislation and people. And in fact, you profiled some folks like Muriel Siebert, who I happen to know, who was the first woman to have a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. But covering so much ground and narrative, anchoring it on these incredible women and their stories, but also on both the innovations and the pieces of legislation that were enacted not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, was so illuminating for me, because, again, without that came before, I would not be here, having not had the rights and opportunities that were secured by others on my behalf. So share a little bit. I mean, you cover a ton of ground, but if you had to summarize just, even a couple of these major either innovations or people or pieces of legislation that were so critical to, having us where we are today, being able to have these conversations, rights that we do, highlight one or two for us before we bring in Heather.
Yeah, it's hard to highlight one or two, as you say, because there are so many individuals and events that we should pay tribute to as we talk about economic empowerment. But one story that I particularly enjoyed reporting and was just so fascinated by was the journey that led to the introduction of the first oral contraceptive that became available for contraceptive use, specifically in the US. It was approved by the FDA in 1960. Some of us probably broadly know the story of Margaret Sanger, know some of the stories of some of the birth control early advocacy. But I just decided to go deep on this. And the reason for that was because I am convinced that reproductive access is one of the things that is one of the most important determinants of economic independence and economic freedom. And we've seen that, in the data. We've seen, for example, the gender pay gap, which of course is no perfect gauge of inequality, and we can get to that later. But just as one example, the gender pay gap was about 60% before the oral contraceptive became available. Now it's closer to 80, 82, 84, depending on which source you trust. So if you just want to look at crude data, you can see the impact that the oral contraceptive had on women's labor force participation, on women's earnings. But I think more fundamentally than that, it sort of acknowledged that sex and reproduction can be separated, that a woman can take control over her own health, her own reproduction, her own life, her own desires, her own ambitions, her personal life, her professional life, and can determine timing as well. I mean, to a greater or lesser extent, of course. But it sort of normalized this conversation around, planning motherhood. And so that's one of the reasons why I went deep on that. There's a whole chapter on it. One of my favorite characters is this woman who has effectively been written out of history, who provided pretty much all of the funding for the research and development that led to the introduction of the first oral contraceptive. And so while I could choose, a dozen other things that were important landmark developments over the past 100 years in terms of economic empowerment, I think the pill and the story that goes with that is probably one of the ones that floats to the top of the pile.
Yes, I could not agree more. That story, and what a badass she was, investor and philanthropist when there were big stakes around this. So again, I'm just going to hold out this incredible book. So we need to know this history. And one of activism we can all do is buy a book and support amazing folks like Josie, who take the time to write history that has not been written about. So thank you. So Heather, I'd love to bring you into this conversation. I mean, you and I have been circling around each other for so long and really landed in the same place at the same time a year ago at the first ever Gender Equity Summit held by the first partner, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, in the state of California. And you were presenting at that time a recent report that you had just completed called Women in the Economy, Lifting Up Women's Voices. I'm going to hold this up too. Wisdom and Experience to Build a Gender Equitable Economy. I hung on every word you said. I loved it. I jumped on you. Well, not on you, but I found you. I think I didn't jump on you, to be clear. I found you quickly and said, I need to know you. I want to bring you to Utah. You immediately just grabbed my attention. So can you set a little bit of context, and feel free to do some background as well about yourself and what led you to produce what really is quite a landmark piece of research?
Thank you so much. So I just want to say, being in conversation with the two of you, my latest and greatest partners in crime, doing good trouble crime. It's just such a relief to be talking with you, and I'm really excited to have so many folks on the LinkedIn conversation today, because this is what we have to do. We have to be in conversation to digest not just what just happened, but also what we do about it. What we do about it is really the key piece. So to your first question, what led to the research? So first of all, I did the research. I was calling it also storytelling, like you, Josie. I just wanted to get out and talk to women. And what led to it was that I had been leading a national coalition called Closing the Women's Wealth Gap for 5 years. And in the course of that, we went through the COVID pandemic. And what happened is, going into the pandemic, we were all excited because women were half the workforce for really the first time in our history. End of 2019, pandemic hit, 14 million women dropped out almost all at once. People were calling it the she-cession. But what was very clear to us, because we had been digging into this work as a network of nonprofits, private, public sector leaders, policymakers, it was very clear the economy was never designed to work for women. And what COVID showed us is that it didn't. And hence, when women were left with no care supports, they had to drop out to care for their families. And women of color who were in low-paying jobs at the front lines of our economy, they were forced to drop out where they could afford to. So all of that led to me wanting to really, during that time, just talk to women and ask them, okay, all of the experts can analyze how to make the economy work for you. What do you think? Mm-hmm. So we did deep dive interviews with 150 women across all different identities, race, ethnicity, age, income, in urban, rural, and suburban communities. And we just asked them, what are the key challenges you face? What are the solutions you envision? And what would it look like if we build an economy that worked for you? So the findings, and I'm sure folks, they're probably in the chat right now, but the findings really came into 3 big buckets. So the first bucket was, without care supports, women are facing a financial penalty across their lifetime when they're pulled out to care for kids, elders, family members with disabilities. Second biggest one is that women during the inflationary crisis post-COVID were in just this cash flow crisis. So it wasn't just inflation, it was that women are in low paying jobs with stagnant wages. And so the wages weren't keeping up, putting them into crisis. And the third, I hate to say it this way, but racial and gender discrimination is alive and well. It came up across every category. So I forgot to mention, we did the interviews. We used the interviews to design a survey. We pulled the top 10 findings. The other thing, and those were the 3 buckets they fell into, but the other thing that was most fascinating is the top 10 were pretty much the same when we disaggregated for all different identities. So when we looked at white women versus Black, Latinx, et cetera, by race and ethnicity, they were also pretty much the same when we pulled it apart to look at what women thought based on their party identity. There were shifts, different things mattered more. Younger women cared more about having face time in the workforce. Most other women prioritized flexible work schedules and the option to work remotely. But pretty much the findings were the same. So what that said to us was that if you look at just women's interests as economic providers for their families, we're more likely to be on the same page than not. So it begs the question, what is it that's dividing us? Jacki.
Yes. I mean, I think about that all the time. And I feel obviously we're in the backdrop of an election where that is the conversation, who voted for what and why and what were the priority issues. But the fact that your research really did say we pretty much care about all the same things. It was really what resonated with me. And there was a pretty clear list that actually do track, I think, to what we're hearing about the outcome, about inflation being a big issue, cost of housing, obviously childcare, and caregiving, unpaid labor, all of those things falling in. So it begs the question, and I love that you asked this as a frame that is, I think, more invitational and approachable, is what does it look like when an economy works for women? Or what does that look like? Because I think we maybe know a little bit more in other countries than we do here in the US, in a place that says we care about families, because this ultimately is about families. And even though it's got a gender frame to it, we're really talking about folks, that we're talking about everyone. These are not policies that come at the expense of others. It's about lifting up those left behind and often left out. So let me ask you that question. When think about what does it look like for an economy to work for women? And maybe Heather, I'll start with you and then turn it over to Josie.
Yeah. So we've been thinking a lot about that when I say we, in our national network at Aspen, in my conversations with all these women. But I think there were really 5 big things that came up. The first was we would acknowledge, value, and support women as key actors in our economy. Second is that we would have zero tolerance for any kind of racial or gender discrimination. And that means from the top down, from corporate leaders, policymakers, all the way down. The third is that we would have unfettered access to opportunities to work, earn, save, really invest in our families and contribute to the economy, really to be able to reach our full potential. The fourth is that all of our systems, all of our economic systems would support women to thrive. So we're talking labor, the tax code, monetary policy, credit policy, all of that would be designed with women in mind and would be supporting women to thrive. And then the final thing is that if our economy really worked for women, we would see women and their families thriving. And that's not what we see right now.
Thank you, Heather. That was an incredible summary. Josie, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I just want to echo everything that Heather said. I couldn't agree more. But I mean, I think it sort of boils down to one thing that sounds kind of cliched and maybe a little bit simplistic, but ultimately we need to treat individuals as humans, right? And we need to acknowledge that individuals are not cogs in systems. We are not widgets that make the economy, that create productivity. We are individuals with individual needs. We have different roles depending on our stages in life. We have different needs. We have different desires. And the way that I see it, the parameters of the labor market to a large extent just don't really take that into account. A lot of the ways our large organizations work are based on, the whims of industrialists who lived 100 and 200 years ago. And we haven't had the bravery, the courage to, fundamentally re-examine whether that really is the best way for us to work. And I think if we did, as Heather's research has found, we would find that it's not actually the best way for us to work. I think, we need an economy that acknowledges that childcare should be a public utility, right? And that sounds sort of extreme, but other countries have gotten much closer to being able to do that. And so why can't we? I think, when we talk about COVID, I think that was in a way this wonderful opportunity for great experimentation, because we were sort of forced to re-examine the way we work in terms of the time that we work, the flexibility, that the location, everything. And one of the things that I find really frustrating is that a lot of organizations, despite the fact that we saw that in many instances productivity did not suffer if we allowed employees to work flexibly and to accommodate childcare and elder care and whatever else was going on, are now snapping back, right back to the way that we were working pre-COVID, almost, ignoring, shoving aside the evidence that suggests that actually there's another way that is more humane, that is more human. And so, I think Heather summarized it perfectly, but I would just add that angle of just sort of fundamentally re-examining why we're doing it all,
Yeah. Could I just jump in there, Jacki? Thank you, Josie, because you reminded me to just make this point. Flexible work schedules and the option to work remotely were the top two priorities in our survey across every single identity of women. And we were doing our survey right when people started to be pushed back into the workforce. And who's making those decisions? Mostly white male corporate leaders that are saying, oh, that's better for the company. Yeah, that's fine, but it's not better for your workers. And your company is going to thrive if your workers are thriving. So again, it's not recognizing women are half the workforce. And if you're not designing systems that work for them, everyone's going to be hurt by it. And then just one last thing, because I know you gave a shout out and we want to really give credit to these women that are writing incredibly, deeply researched books about this. So another important one is called Overwork by Bridget Schulte at New America. And, her first book 10 years ago was Overwhelmed, and how women were trying to do it all, but you can't without systems of support. But Overwork, what I love about it is it lifts up so many examples of how we can design better workforces, how we can take people's whole lives into account. And when I say people, men and women, but we choose not to. And that's the thing. How do we then take it upon ourselves to create the demand for that change? Because clearly it's not in the financial interest of some of our leaders. So it's really on us.
Well, it is in the financial interest.
Yeah, that's the point. You're right. I misspoke.
It's not in their immediate quarterly capitalism financial interest.
That's right.
But ultimately, as you know, and I know, when women thrive economically, everyone thrives, right?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good catch.
Well, thank you. And we're going to post all these resources in the chat and just encourage anyone listening, if you have comments or questions, if things resonate with you, pop your comments into the chat. This will live on this recording. So we'd love to capture what's resonating for you. But just an anchor, I'll have to admit, having grown up, I had a career at Goldman Sachs, and it was and I sometimes have my own checks and balances around this, is this idea that, you grew up, I had to be at work, that's what it was for me. And those folks, obviously, the current, especially big companies and corporate leaders, I think there are some absolutely that are evolving, but it's this mindset that productivity is dependent on face time. And it's taken me a while on a personal level to really adjust to that. And at the end of the day, it's about trusting people.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there is this idea that you can't trust people to do the work and to have productivity. And I think the opposite is true. When you support folks and are accommodative, they feel more loyal, more accommodative. And I could give so many examples of that from companies that we've heard stories around here in Utah that made those shifts, especially accommodative with something like a maternity leave and wanting to design flexibly for people to return. And once they did change policies and practices and allow that flexibility, the returnship was incredible. And it's simply naive to think that you can have a modern workplace and not be accommodative. So to your point, Josie, it is a positive economic decision, but that kind of change or that shift that you can trust people and that you can do things differently, I think is just still causing, a lot of, it's such a huge barrier. And maybe we need a generation of folks to prove that differently, but there's lots of evidence to support that. So again, thank you for your comments. So I want to turn to some of these policy issues that we're talking about and some of the big factors that are sort of given as indicators that there continue to be big barriers when it comes to sort of economic access and equality. And one of them is the ongoing gender pay gap. And Josie, you talk about that we've made a lot of progress, especially when women have the opportunity and resources to choose when they have children. We know that a lot of the pay gap is still a motherhood penalty, much more so than just a pure demographic one based on gender. Of course, race comes into that hugely. But we also know it's a number that is as you said, a crude measure of inequality, but nevertheless a measure. And the fact is, most people's source of income is are their wages. So the idea that there's still penalties associated with it, or there's still ongoing discrimination, is troubling. And I don't think anyone would say, oh yeah, discrimination is great, let's underpay people for the same work. But unpack this what the wage gap is a measure of and what it is not. And I think we want to stretch it to say that it's one measure, but it's actually a way more complex discussion when we think about sort of what gets in the way of especially women earning appropriate and balanced wages for the work that they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we actually don't talk about it enough. I think it's a sort of lazy way of talking about inequality generally. But as you say, it's also a valuable starting point. And I think that one demonstration of that is in the UK, where I spent a lot of my career writing about this. We have a gender pay gap in effect since 2017 that mandates every corporation that employs at least 250 people to annually publish their gender pay gap by quartile. So what the gender pay gap is at the lowest quartile of pay, the second, the third, the fourth. Again, of course, this data doesn't capture everything. There is so much missing. There's so much nuance that should it be in there. But what it has done is that it has elevated the conversation. It has made it part of the mainstream conversation in media, in corporate, in governance. And so that is a start. So I think, yes, certainly let's not undermine the value of using the gender pay gap to determine some sort of gauge around the inequality. But as you say, that there are other ways to look at it too. I think the gender pay gap doesn't, for example, capture the qualitative experience of people in the labor market in the way that we might be able to do using other means. I also think that there's generally not enough attention paid to occupational segregation, which is understanding that is actually kind of key to understanding inequality and understanding the gender pay gap. In other words, the fact that lower paid occupations tend to have an overrepresentation of women. That is crucial to understanding the way that the labor force is evolving. We know that women were particularly vulnerable to job losses during COVID-19 because they tended to be overrepresented in the industries that were most affected by job losses. So it wasn't a fact that that bosses were intentionally laying off women. It was just that those industries tended to be most vulnerable to layoffs. So, I mean, Heather, jump in here, but I just feel like there's such a huge caveat that is necessary when we talk about the gender pay gap. And the other thing that I would actually just add is that a lot of people tend to think of the gender pay gap as a gauge of discrimination, explicit discrimination or unconscious bias, whatever it is. It's not that. That is a small part of it, but so much of it is just the construct, the sort of infrastructure of our economies. And I think it's just so critical that we understand that.
That is so helpful to say it and look at it that way, because I really think more than anything, it's an indicator of systems that weren't designed to work for huge swaths of our economy. And I think, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that what is happening in Europe, and the fact that companies, large corporations, are by law required to report their data. That is not the case in the US, and it's probably likely to become less so in this administration based on the last time this president-elect was in office. So what I find really interesting, though, about the European measure is that, as you described it, it's not the same as equal pay for equal work. It's looking at the median pay for men and women across a company. So there's two things that are really important. One is they're global companies, Citibank, like a lot of financial institutions that are global. So it's data that is relevant to us in the US. We can use that data. But what it's showing us is not really equal pay for equal work, it's showing us occupational segregation, as you flagged, and the fact that women may start out at the same point as men in their career, but at some point men move ahead and women don't. So, okay, one reason is for sure discrimination, right? We know that, even though that is not the only reason. But this is where all these other issues come into play, because every time a woman is pulled out because she's the one that the school calls when their child is sick, or she's the one that has to take care of an elder and take them to their, their appointment, or even take in an elder because they're no longer able to take care of themselves. Like that, all of those caregiving burdens still fall on women. And every time that happens, we lose opportunities for promotion, we spend down our savings, we are pulled out, we lose income, we lose job opportunities. So that's coming into play. The other thing that's coming into play is just that, women often have to, for at that period in their life where they are caregiving, they can't afford to take on these roles that require more of their time. So all of that to say, it's in our economic interest to solve these issues. This is an economic issue, and it's systems that need to change. So we have to recognize, unless we solve for caregiving, discrimination, the pay gap, occupational segregation, and unless we can think of these complex issues all at once, we're not going to get to the solutions that really enable all families to thrive. So we got to embrace the complexity, but really push for data, because that's the only way to measure how we're doing.
And I would just jump in here, if I may. I just wanted to allude, because this anecdote just perfectly illustrates what Heather was talking about. In the prologue to my book, I write about this conversation that I had with the CEO of a very large corporation, a global corporation. It was off the record. I won't be able to ever say who it was, but it was a male CEO. And I said to him, I said, how do you characterize the gender pay gap? Why do you think the gender pay gap in your organization still exists? And why do you think it's barely moved over the last 20 years? And he said to me that I had to understand that sometimes when a woman takes a temporary leave of absence to take a maternity leave, for example, when she comes back, she's just not as professionally ambitious as she was. And you two have heard this story a dozen times. I've told you, I keep coming back to it. But I think this misconception at the highest echelons of business, that there is this element of pure choice involved in a career path of a woman, is so dangerous. Because sure, it might look like ambition, it might look like choice, but there are so many factors, visible and invisible, that are contributing to the way that a woman chooses to live her life. And in the vast majority of cases, the infrastructure and the support systems are just not there that would allow her to reach her professional potential.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So much to just add on, but just quickly, I've had so many conversations with women who have chose to leave the workplace for whatever reason. And one of the biggest ones that I've heard, especially at senior levels, is this idea of feeling valued, and women often, this more senior you get too, you have this double shift of mentoring, especially in industries that are predominantly male dominated. There's that second shift at home, there's the second shift at work. And, you take a lot on, to try to represent. And so I think there's that aspect of it. There's also what I found too, this idea of, to your point, of like job segregation, why I am such a huge champion of women thinking about careers in finance, particularly wealth management, in areas where there is upside, where your career trajectory, if you do things well, you can actually continue on in an upward trajectory of the amount of money you can make. And I am super concerned in this environment now where we're shifting to AI, where this idea of digital acumen, in fact, working on a program with an amazing company called UpLevel that's looking to create opportunities for women to upgrade their digital acumen, because you have to be thinking about what are the jobs of the future. And of course, I realize there's privilege in even being able to do that. But, this thoughtfulness that I think is ever more necessary when you're making those trade-off decisions of what kind of educational training you're going to go into, what are the levels of debt you might have to incur, and what is the financial picture, even if everything goes right, to align with that pay down of debt, align with your goals and aspirations. And I think sometimes we're just like, go be a teacher, go be a nurse, all those things, wonderful and needed, and play that out in terms of what that means for your economic and financial future. And are you even picking an industry or a company where you're going to be supported? So thanks for just tagging this idea of complexity, because it does come down to all these things that add up for any one person to leave. And we're talking about scale and things that matter bigger than that. But it also invites us to know that there are solutions and there are ways we can mentor and support each other, to keep folks in career paths in that trajectory, and feeling valued at work is one of the key things, in my opinion. So we have so much more ground to cover, and thank you for your comments that are popping up in the chat. I want to talk about the care economy because that's come up a few times already. Of course, we're talking as a policy issue that's going to come up. Access to affordable childcare. And again, this is recognized that the vast majority of people work because they have to. This is not just a woman's issue. This is, a family issue. But we lack so much in affordable childcare, across this country. It's true here where we live. And if you don't have that, all sorts of, derailment happens. But we tend to think of it as just the cost of childcare, but I think you both have also just stretched that to say it's so much more complex than that. But talk about this as the care economy and as something that gets in the way of women's economic progress. And again, just so many angles to take that. But, Heather, why don't I start with you?
Yeah. Well, I just want to start with a comment that Janet Yellen made, Treasury Secretary Yellen, which was the care economy is a classic example of a broken market. Like, it does not work on the demand or the supply side. And because of that, we're all suffering. So to break that down, on the demand side, we cannot afford caregiving. Like, the vast majority of American women do not have access to caregiving through their families. And we're all, as so many of us, so many of women with, the latest data is that 3 out of 4 women with kids under 5 are in the workforce. Our childcare supply was decimated during COVID. So many of them, small family caregivers went under. So we have a lack of supply of caregiving, and then we have a huge demand, and most of us can't afford that cost. Like, the average cost right now, I believe it's about $11,000. And a third of low-income households cannot afford childcare. So childcare is a big issue. That market is broken. But the big looming issue is elder care, because every advanced industrialized economy has a workforce that's aging very rapidly. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like every friend I talk to lately is now coming into this point in their lives where they're taking care of their young kids and their parents. So that affects men and women. It deeply affects families' economic security. In the US, we have very broken systems for long-term care and supports, where people are actually spending down their assets to get public support when they can get it. So all of that to say, the care economy is infrastructure. If we don't have the infrastructure that's working for families, we all lose, because workers pull out at a time where our workforce is shrinking. Mm-hmm. So we are in this situation where we need to elevate the conversation about care. We have to make it a care issue. And I guess the one thing I have to say is all this stuff is solvable. Like, come on, it's about priorities. Every other advanced industrialized country, their leaders recognize they need to keep women in the workforce to remain economically competitive. Mm-hmm. And somehow our leaders miss the memo. It's time. We need to address this. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Josie, over to you. That was a long answer.
No, that was great. One thing I would say is that I know it's super clear, but the undue burden of care work that falls on the shoulders of women does not only cement inequality, but it exacerbates it, obviously, to a huge extent as well, because people make financially rational decisions, right? And if you are in a household where you know that one person is going to have to take a step out of the paid labor market in order to provide the unpaid labor that is necessary to keep the family functioning and the community alive, then it's going to be the person who brings home the smaller paycheck, right? So as if we don't fix the care economy, we will never fix inequality. Okay. I kind of lost my train of thought here, but what I was going to say was that, you know, we needn't look far to see that solutions are feasible and that they can actually be implemented. And there are countries, particularly in Scandinavia, I know that's the famous example, that have actually done a brilliant job of kind of de-gendering care work. Sort of, you know, we still feminize care work. We still consider care work to be inherently a woman's job. We see that everywhere. We see that in, there was some wonderful data that came out earlier this week, actually, from the Reykjavik Index around trust in women leaders in certain industries. And what we see is that we still have blind trust in women being leaders in the care economy, in care work, in teaching, in childcare. We're still averse as a society to men being in leadership roles in that care work. And so, you know, again, we keep coming back to the same kind of chorus, but I'm going to repeat it again because I think it's so important. We need to, in the same way as we need to start talking about gender equality as a non-gender specific imperative, as an economic imperative, we also need to start thinking about the care crisis as a non-gendered crisis, right? Exactly. This is something that men and women have to play the same part in. You know, there's some brilliant people who are doing work on this. Richard Reeves, who wrote the book of Boys and Men. I'm consistently impressed by the messaging that he is using around this. The extent to which, you know, maybe we've forgotten about young men in this conversation too much in the past. And if we actually want to create an economy in which gender is not a barrier to professional success, then we have to address every single side of the coin. And we're not doing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is so complex. And, you know, to your point, Heather, this is solvable. Other places are doing it. It costs money. It's not always public money. I'm encouraged to see that private funding increasingly, you know, I invest in a couple of funds. Springbank Collective is one of them that has a care thesis. You know, there are market opportunities. There could be subsidized private-public partnerships, especially in a localized context. We can bring our creativity to this challenge if we want to, and it's not just all national. It can be extremely local. And I think that's, again, where we all have a vote and a say, especially, you know, in a more localized context, that can find solutions. So there are a few more topics in our 10 more minutes before we wind up. One, I want to cruise through this one, but it's such an important one, and we'll post some resources in the chat. And we talked about it in the newsletter, is the idea, because it's such a hot issue with respect to being on the ballot, is access to abortion. And I think we've talked about reproductive health and the pill as being a major catalyst to choice and timing of families. But what I don't think folks realize, and I certainly didn't, was how much research and data there is around why this is fundamentally a big economic issue, So Heather, maybe I'll start with you, because that came up a little bit in your research that you did with women in the economy. And Josie, I know this is a big topic area for you. So I'd only love to give this a couple of minutes, and we'll post some data in the chat and a compelling report about this, but I'd love to invite you both to comment on it.
Yeah, great. I would love to jump in. So we did ask that question in our survey. We asked women just what they thought about abortion, how much the Dobbs decision had come down a little bit, like a couple months before we were doing our surveying. 7 out of 10 of our 1,200 plus respondents said that access to abortion had a direct economic impact on their economic security. So a direct, not a direct economic, but anyway, a direct impact. That was true for women across identities. So what I want to say is, again, we're looking at a continuum of factors that affect women's ability to build the economic security of their families and for themselves. And one of them is access to our reproductive health care. And so I know a great book that really brings this to life is by Shefali Luthra at a 19th News reporter called Undue Burden. I highly recommend it because she tracked women before and after the Dobbs decision. And in all of the stories, it's the economic impact of not being able to control your own body that plays such a huge role in both women's economic security and their mental health. So I just want to say that, yes, again, all these issues are connected and we have to look at them as a whole.
Yeah.
Josie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, I think everybody now knows that there is a direct correlation between access to reproductive rights and economic independence and health, financial well-being. I think that Gillian was kind enough to post a resource in the chat that I came across recently, a report published by Congress's Joint Economic Committee showing that during the course of 2023, so the first full year since the Dobbs decision, over 171,000 women traveled out of state because of restrictions in their state in order to access those services that they need, in some cases to save their lives. And I think that is just one small data point, but it is so powerful because it brings to life the extent to which these policy issues are just, I mean, I don't even really have the words for it, quite frankly,
Yeah.
But the data is coming in hot and thick and fast, and we see it everywhere. We see the lived experiences, the outcomes, the economic outcomes that individuals are suffering who don't have access to these critical services. We're going to see a lot more. And a resource that I found particularly helpful as well is the work that the Center of Reproductive Rights does. I think they're a whole load of non pro bono lawyers who are doing absolutely critical work, and I think that is going to continue to be the case over the next few years and into the new administration.
And could I add one thing, Jacki? Do we have a second? Sure. I just want to say, across all of these issues, we have to recognize that Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian American women are much more deeply impacted than white women. We are about to become a people of color nation. It's within the next generation. Women of color will, before that happens, become the majority of the female workforce. In all of these areas that we're discussing, access to abortion, maternal health is a huge one. Pay equity, access to childcare, occupational segregation, like women of color are impacted the most deeply. And then on the flip side, they're also the ones that are striving the most. Like they are the ones more likely to be earning college degrees, more likely to be graduating with a PhD or a graduate degree, more likely to be starting businesses. So I feel like we have to, we do need to recognize we all share common economic challenges and ideas about solutions, but we also need to look at what are the different effects affecting different women in our population, and then to solve for those explicitly.
And I'm sorry, Jacki, I know you're trying to move on.
It's okay.
I feel like there's one more really important point I just want to make, which is that this is not just a cost to an individual, right? And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to frame all of these issues as common economic imperatives, right? And so I think one thing that's really important to remember is that the cost of abortion bans does not only affect the individual, it affects states, it affects the federal economy. And I don't know if we've shared it in the chat yet, but the Institute for Women's Policy Research did one study showing that abortion bans are now costing the US economy $68 billion every year. And that is because businesses are moving out of states where abortion restrictions are particularly strict, because they can't attract the talent, because people don't want to live in those states and work for those companies that are based in those states. So this is a common burden, right? I think that it's important to highlight the individual suffering and the individual experiences, but this is something that all of us are paying the price for.
Yeah, and there was so much more to talk about here, but that is such a good point, Josie and Heather, just to say, like, people can make their individual choices, that, of course, that is what a free country is about. And to not consider the overall economic impact, especially, where the vast majority of folks, even in states that did obviously highly endorse sort of a more conservative red agenda, still landed with wanting to protect access to abortion. So I think the vast majority of people actually believe this. And I think that's why this issue is so painful, that it so becomes this individual choice thing. And the irony of being pro or anti-choice in that sense, and then not having childcare and all these options that actually support people have families, just hurts me to my core. So we have one more. We only have 5 minutes, which is also hurting me to my core. But I want to just do one thing quickly, which really, there are two areas where I feel we didn't cover. One is health. And we talked about it in the context of, obviously, reproductive health. But this is a huge area, and we're going to post something in the chat, which is another study that I just want to call attention to, that from McKinsey Health Institute with the World Economic Forum has a recent report saying closing the women's health gap is a $1 trillion opportunity that not only is going to save lives, but improve economies. And again, this is such a win-win. You save lives and you create businesses and you invest. Often women-founded startups are addressing key areas. We've already talked menopause in our pre-call. We're not going to get to that much on our call today. But, there's just tremendous economic both opportunity cost and opportunity in not investing in women's health. And I just want to give a quick shout out to, in particular, to Melinda Gates and her work with Pivotal Ventures that have catalyzed huge amounts of funding. Obviously, Jill Biden had a huge initiative. We're going to also post another one in the chat. Dear friend, Carolee Freelander, with her work with Women Health Access Matters. So we're not going to get to that, which hurts me, but we're going to post it in the chat. So I'm going to just turn it back over to you two with just a couple of minutes left to go for just closing thoughts. And I will say, this is not the end of any conversation. This is the beginning of what we hope will be an ongoing conversation about the economy and women and policies, because there is a lot of ground to cover. So again, just an invitation for everyone to continue to connect with us. So Josie, over to you, maybe for a minute of wrap-up comments. We'll come back to Heather and then just close out the session today.
Yeah, I mean, how does one wrap up something like this, right? We can't. But I think one thing that I keep coming back to this week, particularly in light of the election outcome last week, is that we have not nailed this, right? We have not figured out how to have a meaningful, inclusive conversation that really reframes the gender debate and the gender issue in non-gender specific terms. So I suppose my call to action for anyone who cares is just to reach out and to be a communicator. I kind of feel like I have to say that. I also teach a communications class at Columbia, so communication is my lifeblood. But we just need to get better at having that dialogue that is rooted in respect, that is rooted in tolerance, and that is rooted in fact as well, right? And I think if we are able to do that, we're on the right track.
Thank you, Josie. Heather, over to you.
Yeah, I've been thinking hard about how we just get around some of the barriers that we've been facing in recent years in terms of women being divided by party affiliation, by race, ethnicity, by sector, nonprofits, corporate leaders, women of means. And I really feel like it's time to recognize we do not have we have not used the power that we have. I had to reframe my own question. we have a lot of power and we're not using it. And the only way to fully leverage it is by working together. So I feel like, coming from sort of the progressive left advocacy world, what I'm really working on is reaching out to women in the corporate space, finding women who, we haven't talked about this great wealth transfer. There's a huge transfer of wealth underway. Finding women who are coming into wealth and connecting them to the movement so they can be hopeful, so they can invest in all these amazing solutions that are coming down the pike, and that so many women of color, women in the grassroots are leading. So I think my biggest takeaway, though, is that we don't have the luxury of getting discouraged. We cannot put our heads in the sand. Like, just get ahead of it. Pay attention to the news. Force yourself, and then get in conversation with people. I feel like the only way to get over all the disinformation is being face to face and really talk through this stuff and try to figure out ways we leverage each other's power.
Amen to all of that. Truly. I mean, I could talk to you too. I mean, big surprise. Why I love these two women. Invite you again, everything in the chat, to follow and track them. There's so many more conversations happening. We're going to share some resources back out basis after this conversation. This will live on both YouTube and on LinkedIn. A few people, wonderful people, thank you for all your comments and joining today. If you love this conversation, send it on to others, and find those two links. You'll find them under the tracking with any of us on this channel. And we also have Heather's talk that we're going to post. She did another conversation with Josie on this topic. Heather also did a talk on our SheMoney Summit. So lots of ways to connect, and just sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We are going to pull these and try to follow up if we did not get all the resources linked to address your questions. But thank you for the engagement, and thank you for the shout outs and for joining us today. And Heather, Josie, thank you especially for your time and generosity and showing up so wholeheartedly today. So have a wonderful day, everyone, and a happy early holiday season. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.